That hideous strength is about two warring parties, as we've mentioned. What looks like it is just a fight between Mark and Jane at the beginning becomes a fight between St. Anne's and Belbury, and ultimately between Logres and Britain. First, let's look at what it looks like on the literal or ground or superficial level. It is between Nice and St. Anne's. And what is Nice? Nice is the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments. And of course, Lewis is playing with the word nice here, which essentially means know nothing or ignorance. And this is an institute which pretends to be nice, but is actually full of nothingness. It is a vacuum. It is complete emptiness. So what is nice and what does it pretend to be in the story? Lord Feverstone first introduces nice to Mark, and he says man has got to take charge of man, and that means, remember, that some men have got to take charge of the rest. Now, what you should remember from the Out of the Silent Planet is Dick Devine actually becomes Lord Feverstone. So Lord Feverstone is a pseudonym. It is a false representation of who Dick Devine actually is, which is just a man who tries to get ahead in every situation. What does he mean? Man has got to take charge of other men. So he is talking about Lewis's idea from the Abolition of Man, that this idea of progress or human beings progressing means that they intend other human beings to stay behind, other human beings to be removed from the society, other human beings to be oppressed by those who decide to be powerful and to rule all. So this idea that human beings have to get ahead only means that some human beings are going to get ahead of others. Lewis is also trying to unveil the ideas that it is just the secular world that is seeing this. So the different characters that he has here represent what Lord Feverstone is talking about, that human beings have to get ahead. We have Mr. Strake representing the church, and the idea is that the church has fallen for this. They're filthy rags of humanism, humanitarianism, liberalism, and here we have a churchman finding himself joining the communist and materialist because he's expediting the coming of a utopia, man getting ahead, progress, the kingdom of God coming through the will of human beings. This is essentially the Tower of Babel. Miss Hardcastle is an ultimate caricature of what it means to be a liberated woman, but she's actually a sadist. Isn't it absolutely essential to keep a fierce left and fierce right, both on their toes and each terrified of the other? She shows that what happens through factionalism and division is it makes room for those who want to progress, to get their ideas through. If you have everyone warring and fighting with one another, they won't notice what it is that you're doing. And finally, Philostrato, the scientist, we have to learn to make our brains live with less and less body, to build our bodies with chemicals and no longer to stuff them with dead roots and weeds. He wants to remove us completely from our humanity and our physicality so that we are nothing but spirit. Essentially, what all these different characters show is that nice, although it pretends to be science, is actually what Lewis would call scientism. It is taking science so that it is all-encompassing, so that everything is only about material. It's what Chesterton feared would happen if the materialist and determinist took over society. It is what happens when we think of ourselves only as material. What you end up doing is also finding no need for the material, and all you're left with is the abstract idea of a person being just a brain, just a mind. This is the ultimate fallacy caused by Cartesian dualism, where you divide the body from the mind and you end up having to have a false choice between the two of them. And this is the same kind of thing that Nice is doing, is creating these false choices, living with a false conception of what it means to be a person. And because of Mark's desire to be in the inner ring, he falls for this. On the other side is St. Anne's. Miss Hardcastle says there are only two alternatives. The alternative of being in Nice or out of Nice, and she says, I know which one would be more fun. On the St. Anne side, it is old-fashioned. It is communal. There are no classes, which completely throws Jane in the beginning when she meets with Mags, who used to be her cleaning lady, and Mags addresses her as though they are friends and are familiar, and Jane finds this discomfiting. For all of her conceptions of human beings being equal, she wants to be equal to Mark despite their gender. She does not see the same sense of egalitarianism between the classes, between her and Mags. But she has to become accustomed to this kind of classlessness in the group at St. Anne's. There is, however, a hierarchy of authority. There is not an inner ring, but Ransom is the director. And this is a strong choice of words on the part of Lewis. He believes that language is important for understanding things accurately. There is an authority that directs, but even that authority is submitted to the Eldils. The Eldils are submitted to Maladil. There is a hierarchy in that sense, but it's not in the sense of Ransom being based on merit, but about gifting and responsibility. There's a traditional understanding of myths. They have passed down these stories of myths and history. They believe in a sense of paideia, of passing ideas on so that they are not lost or forgotten. You will not see this in Belbury. And an emphasis on what's natural, on gardens. You see the mice that come into Ransom's room. You see the animals, the bear that lives with them, that they all become a family, that they are all part of a world together and they belong within each other's world. And finally, a priority on language, as I've mentioned, the idea that you understand what words mean and that we cannot lose what words mean, as well as what words mean. And we do have Ransom being a philologist. We also have what Jane's images or her visions mean, that there is meaning behind the things that we see in the reality. And this is completely disregarded at Belbury. They throw out morals. Everything becomes utilitarian. There's a false idea. Wither constantly talks about them being a family together, and yet he doesn't mean the same thing as the family at St. Anne's. Instead, it's not a family, it's how useful are people. Miss Hardcastle continually tells Mark, the goal is to be useful and to do what you're told. There's abstract goals, as we mentioned with Philostrato, that we become less and less dependent on our physical nature and more independent from it, so that we are just floating minds. They do not believe in a sanctity of life. People are disposable. They quickly kill Hengist at the beginning when he tries to leave Nice. There's a sense that if you try to leave, you will not live. And they completely destroy people without thinking about individuals as persons with liberty and dignity. And of course, there's little value to history or tradition or the classics or knowledge or any of those old disciplines that Belbury disregards, because they prioritize instead scientism. And again, many people accused Lewis after reading this book that he was against science, but he was not. He was against the use of science becoming all-encompassing apart from ethics, theology, and history. That science is one of the liberal arts among the seven and does not need to be a totalitarian discipline that takes over all the rest. And of course, we will look at the misuse of language becomes central to why it is that Belbury succeeds as they do. These two alternatives begin appearing only like St. Anne's and Belbury, two different communities, but what we realize is the two different communities are actually, in a medieval understanding, moving one more towards heaven or more towards hell, that you have to move in a direction. You're either ascending or descending. In St. Anne's at the manor, when Jane first arrives, the whole place makes her feel like it's the garden in Peter Rabbit or Romance of the Rose or Alice in Wonderland. And for those of us who have read Surprised by Joy, we should hear Jane's reflections on the garden sound very similar to Lewis's reflection on the boxed garden or his enamoration with Squirrel Nutkin, that he was enamored with the idea of autumn that he found there, that he loved the Beatrix Potter books. Tolkien, by the way, too, we'll look at, loved the Beatrix Potter books. That there was something being inspired by the imagination in those things that drew one towards joy, that drew one towards heaven. These glimmers were representations of Sehnsucht, of this longing for something that is beyond this world. And so this longing that Jane feels, where she tries to connect it with Peter Rabbit or these other texts that she's read, she's really getting in touch with the longing that it's moving her towards something higher, though she cannot name what that is yet. Also, when she reflects on her meeting with Ransom, she says 3 times her world was unmade. This goes back to the Chestertonian idea that he was always trying to stand us on our heads because we've been walking around on our heads. So by flipping us, we're actually going to be walking right side up. So her world has to get unmade to be made rightly because it's been made malformed, and so she has to be reformed. She has to be converted, in a sense, to a new way of seeing. So her previous world gets unmade by her interactions with Ransom and St. Anne's. Ransom calls himself in this text the Pendragon, right? He's the imagined Arthur of her childhood, the imagined Solomon. These are the things that Jane feels upon meeting him, that he's the king, he's the lover, he's the proper magician. And she associates with him everything sweet and lovely and beautiful. On the other side is Bellberry. When Mark goes for a walk in the garden, instead, the grounds were not the kind of grounds you could walk for pleasure. There were iron railings and slabs and varnished metal. The whole effect was like that of a municipal cemetery. In comparison between the two worlds, you have the warmth of Ransom, Mother Dimble, Arthur, and Camilla, and you have the hardness of Feverstone, hard castle, wither like death, frost like winter. It was always winter and never Christmas. So the two worlds are compared even by the words. In a sense, you could write a poem of beauty about the gardens and the life at St. Anne's Manor. Even the name St. Anne versus Bellberry, right? The words themselves have connotations of goodness or evil in them that Jane is drawn towards and that Mark seems immune to at first. I want to dwell for a minute on the misuse of language that we find in this text. This was crucial to the argument in the Abolition of Man. If you remember in Abolition of Man, Lewis said, once you have gone from saying someone kills someone to liquidating them, one of those you can actually approve of the liquidation of assets. But if it means to kill off people who are no longer useful to you, then that becomes a problem. You can hide it. Or as Feverstone tells Mark, he is being asked to camouflage everything with the misuse of language. He says, odd thing it is, the word experiment, unpopular, but not the word experimental. You mustn't experiment on children, but offer the dear little kiddies free education and an experimental school, and it's all correct. And that's the same thing that what Mark should pick up on is when he has conversations like this at Nice, no one talks directly. No one talks and says exactly what it is that they mean. Instead, you really don't know what people mean because they talk around things. They're constantly lying in their speech with one another. This is something that Jane would have picked up on that Mark seems completely oblivious to. When Jane meets the head of her organization and she meets Ransom, she has an experience of joy in which her world is unmade. One of the most beautiful passages from the book is when she meets the Pendragon Ransom, also known as the Fisher King, and she rides the train home. In another misogynistic moment, he has told her that she must go home in order to ask her husband's permission to join him, which Jane finds horrific, and I think rightly so. But whenever she thinks back to the director, she thinks of joy. As she looks out the windows of the train, she sees beams of sunlight pouring over stubble and burnished woods. It has changed her vision. She feels the music of the spheres. These were the notes of a trumpet. Her eyes are drawn to rabbits and cows. She hears a man nearby and hears the beauty of his sunny old mind, sweet as a nut and English as a chalk down. And she reflects on music and wants to listen to Bach that evening or read Shakespearean sonnets. And once more there was a little vanity, she said, For beauty was made for others, and her beauty belonged to the director. Again, we have a little bit of misogyny, but not if we think about it in a larger sense of beauty being something that is a gift to be given back to the giver, not necessarily beauty only found in a woman, the way that Lewis would have read that it was in Milton, that she was made for loveliness and gentleness, and he was made for arguments and for thinking. That's Milton's distinction that Lewis was very drawn to if you read Preface to Paradise Lost. But here the idea that beauty was meant to give back, as Gerard Manley Hopkins says in The Golden Echo and The Leaden Echo, that beauty that only looks at itself and takes in upon itself becomes heavy and dull like lead and is drawn downward and descends. But beauty that is given back, back, back to the giver, give beauty back. That kind of echo leads one higher, that is where it emanates light and goodness and leads one towards joy. I think that's the sense we should read, this idea of her giving beauty back to its source, that she's being drawn to something beyond the director, and it's not a relationship. She's not a fawning young girl over Ransom. She's being drawn to something that's beyond Ransom. Maybe even the sense that Dante was drawn to Beatrice, right? He's drawn to something beyond Beatrice, and Beatrice's eyes are drawing him towards seeing Christ. When Mark, however, meets the head, it is a completely different experience. He meets something so grotesque that it horrifies him and he faints. We get the sense of his experience from Jane's vision. I think that if we saw it in its full force, I'm not sure what kind of effect it would have upon Mark. But we're getting it through Jane sees Mark seeing the head, and Mark reflects on this memory, and he says that his virtues had almost succeeded in banishing from his mind, and these still lived, if only negatively and as weaknesses, in his body. He approved of vivisection, but never worked in a dissecting room. He knew nothing about the last half cup of cocoa drunk slowly 10 days before. He feels a sense that he is fighting for his very self. What Lewis is drawing us towards is these are all fine ideas in theory. When you see it, his body revolts. His body rejects this as horrifying, even though his mind can cognitively say that it's okay and can cognitively defend the existence of Alcazan's head as the leader of Nice.